Today I'm delighted to be joined by Pat McCann, CEO and founder of Dalata Hotel Group, Ireland's largest hotel group. Pat is an industry veteran with over 50 years of experience in the business. He started his career in 1969 with Ryan Hotels, where he spent 20 years before joining Jewry's Hotel Group as general manager of its flagship Ballsbridge Hotel. He was appointed operations director and to the main board of Jewry's Hotel Group plc in 1994, and subsequently had responsibility for the integration of the Doyle Hotel Group following its acquisition by Jewry's in 1999. In 2000, he became CEO of Jewry's Doyle Hotel Group plc, a position he held until 2006. Pat was also a non-executive director at Greencore and EBS, and now sits on the board of Glenveagh plc and is president of IBEC. I first met Pat in 2000 when I returned to Ireland, and then again in 2007 when Pat founded Dalata Hotel Group and acquired 11 leased and managed hotels from Choice Hotels. Soon after, the tide went out on the Irish economy and hotel trade, but Pat did what he has been doing for over 50 years and turned a crisis into an opportunity and grew Dalata into the award-winning company it is today. Pat, thanks for taking the time to speak with me and our listeners today. It's been 3 weeks since Ireland's hotels were allowed to reopen. You've been busy. Tell me how you're getting on.
So, good morning and good morning to the listeners. We're getting on better than we expected. However, everything is relative. So, if you take it that we probably end up doing maybe 35-40% occupancies when we'd normally be expected to do 80 odd plus into 90s this time of year. So it's been very different. However, for us, we were lucky in that while most of our hotels closed, about 15 of them remained operational. And what that allowed us to do was to develop protocols and systems that meant that when we were reopening, it was a relatively simple task compared to a lot of my colleagues in the industry who struggled to get teams together and all of that type of thing that created its own problems. So for us, it happened pretty smoothly because reopening is always going to be more difficult than actually shutting down, and that proved to be the case. We're essentially, we have almost everything open. I have 2 that's partially open at this point, and the rest are fully operational out of the 44. And we're back on all the sites in Marion Road, down on the Samuel on the Salesforce.com site. We're on the site, the 2 hotel sites in Glasgow, 2 in Manchester, 1 in Bristol. Shoreditch hasn't started yet, and neither has Birmingham. But we're in great shape.
You talk about new openings there, Pat, and I suppose something that we've talked in the past is the supply of rooms in Dublin.
Yeah.
And how do you see that evolving now in the next few years?
I think it'll dramatically change. I think a lot of the muted supply, as we call it, that was scheduled to come in, probably a lot of that is under question if it hasn't already started. And even some of the things that have started, rumour on the street, and of course there's a lot of rumour out there now, is that some of them may not get finished. But if somebody hasn't started a project by now, the likelihood of it starting at this point in time is pretty remote, unless they have very strong funding. And that's going to be the big issue, because funders will be looking at this and saying, not too sure about this anymore. Like when you have occupancies hovering down around 35, 40, and I know it's short term, but it will determine in the short term how people get funded or not, as the case may be. So my view is that a lot of the supply that we thought might come in is simply not going to happen.
So coming back to, I suppose, more immediate Dublin, you have 20% plus of the supply in Dublin.
Yeah.
And I think you've opened all of your hotels here.
Yes.
And yet occupancies or demand is quite low in the summer. What's the rationale for opening all hotels?
Well, essentially because of the way we structured the business. When we did the shutdown, my objective was to keep all the teams in place. So all the senior teams in each hotel and in central office were all kept in place. So I had that sunk cost, for want of a better word. So anything that I take in revenue then above that reduces my cash burn. It's simple economics. So it made sense for me to get the hotels back in operation. Like, if I look at June, and June we weren't open, either here in the UK. Two of my hotels made a profit in June. Liffey Valley and Manchester Airport. So even in the depths of despair, we were still able to produce enough cash to outstrip the cost of doing business. And the same principle will apply now, that it will reduce my cost, and it makes sense to open. Because it doesn't matter when I open, there's going to be a run-in period that will have to build up. And of course, it's so different now in that you have a total dependency on domestic leisure. That's really the only business that's opening, because our normal flows of business, like tour operator, corporate, events driven, all of that's gone. So it's a very different market. So we're all starting from zero. So we have no base. And that's the reality of life. And we just have to learn to live with that for a period of time. How long, I have no idea.
So it's rebuilding the machine effectively.
Correct. But having had the people and the teams in place was huge advantage when we eventually started to open our doors on the 29th of June.
So 29th of June, that's heading for a month ago, but back in April, which is a lifetime ago in some ways, you said that you would love to think that we'd see some flickers of recovery from September.
Yeah.
How are we in that perspective? Are we ahead of expectations?
I think, I suppose one of the expectations was that hotels mightn't open up until September. That was initially, and then it moved back to the 20th of July, and then obviously back to 29th of June. September will be interesting, and it'll depend entirely on whether we're opened up as an economy, whether we have international flights, where they're coming from, because, you know, ironically, if we open up, let's say, to Spain or France or whatever, it is not going to make a huge impact on incoming. What really needs to happen is that we need to be connected to the US and to the UK. There are two primary sources of both corporate and events-driven business. And unfortunately, both of those countries are probably in the lower leagues when it comes to performance against COVID. So that's going to be quite a challenge. But certainly for Ireland to kind of show signs of recovery, that's the first thing that happens. We have to get the corporate traffic back. And when you look at, you know, I suppose the traffic between London and Dublin, like it's the second busiest air route in the world, and having that shut down is significant challenges for us. And until we see that happening, I don't see any major signs of recovery. The difficulty will be, of course, for a lot of hotels, will be how will they survive through what could be a very difficult winter, because they haven't had any time to build up any cash reserves, and that's going to be a huge challenge for people. Thankfully, in Dalata, we're in good shape, and last week you may have seen we announced our new deal with our banks, and I have to say our banks were extraordinarily helpful. The reality is that gives us further liquidity, which we don't necessarily need, but it's nice to have it in the event of. So we're well protected. So we have cash resources today of either undrawn facilities or cash of just over 200 million. So it is a good place to be in that sense.
So with that kind of positive note in that, what opportunities does that lead you to?
That's a great question, because Dalata was born out of a crisis. Like when we opened, when I did the deal with you, Tom, and it was you with you, Tom, sitting across the table, and I remember Martin Purtle saying something about the fact that cash flow falls off a cliff in October.
And the bankers falling off their chair.
But of course it didn't work out like that. Obviously we had the financial crash. But what Dalata were able to do was respond very quickly. And if you remember, like, we had the 11 hotels, and by the end of 2009, we became the largest hotel operator in the country. Not necessarily the owner or leaser of assets, but operator, because of all the management contracts. And that came down to the fact the way we had structured the business, where we're a quasi-PLC, and where we had all the good governance in place. And what that meant was for banks and receivers, we were a perfect fit because we ticked their governance boxes as well. So we grew, and if I looked at our performance in 2010, we were actually ahead of where we were in 2007. There was very few companies came out of the financial crisis better than they went into it. And of course that formed the basis of the new Dalata. And we started then, as we got into 2011, started to look and say, you know what? There's something here that's beginning to move and change, and we need to be part of that. And that's how all this happened. It's by being aware of what's happening around you. And as we go through this crisis, there will be casualties. There's no way that that people are going to come out of this unscathed. And particularly across UK and Europe, there are some hotel companies that are in deep stum, and therefore they are going to take some time to recover, if they ever recover. And what will happen, of course, is that as we go through this cycle, some companies have behaved badly in terms of their landlords and the way they behaved and treated them. And what will happen is that you will have a whole different regime of pricing. So essentially for some of these companies, their covenants are broken forever. So the pricing for these guys is going to change them, because there's a risk premium for these guys now. Whereas if you look at the two best behaved companies, which is Dalata and Whitbread, we would probably be in an advantageous position to do other things because of the crisis.
Yeah, your focus was on survival after 2007, growth. The IPO then brought you into buying Irish hotels in the opportunistic time. And then I suppose the last few years, a major focus on the UK and single hotel development. So is what I'm hearing there's opportunities perhaps for chunkier deals and maybe beyond the UK?
At this point, I simply don't know. And with all crises, you need to be careful that you don't start jumping too soon, because some of the better options will come later. And I don't believe there'll be too many opportunities before the end of this year. Excuse me. And therefore what we need to do is just bide our time and see what we can do and see what's coming out of the woodwork. It'd be wrong to say that there isn't a lot of conversations going on as we speak, because there is. But some of those are conversations that will be very short-lived by nature, but some of them will be longer term. And what we see as we roll through this, some opportunities will emerge for Dalata out of this. I've no doubt in my mind about that. And we need to be very careful and very aware of what we're doing in that space.
You mentioned before we sat down, you've been 51 years in the industry working every day, and I suppose you then have a greater insight from history into the future. So when do you think the trade might get back towards 2019 levels? Is it 2022 or 2023? And how might it vary from Dublin to regional Ireland or to the UK, markets in which you know very well?
So my view on it is pretty simple, in the sense that I've looked at 2020 as being a year of surviving and making sure that you had your cash and all of the good things in place. And 21 then is about rebuilding the business. And 22 we will see some levels of normality, as I call it. It is unlikely that it will have reached 2019 levels. But as we get into the second half of 22 and on into 23, that's when I see we'll have probably be getting back to what we are used to doing, because the mix of business will be there at that point in time. And that's the way I look at it. And if you focus on that, because, one of the things that everybody has to remember is that we all have to rebuild our businesses. So the idea that we just start from scratch, like everything is to be rebuilt from scratch. And I'm lucky in that all the relationships I have with my customers is still very strong. And that includes tour operators, includes corporates, all of what I call the key providers of chunky business. And that will stand well to us as we start to come out of this. So, but I still see 21 as a year of rebuilding our business. And then 22 will be where I feel we have some levels of normality, but not back to the 2019 levels.
You talk about communicating with people there and shareholders, customers and staff. Dalata has, I think, 5,000 staff approximately across the islands. What's the situation with them, and how many are back at work now, and how are the supports relatively between the UK and Ireland?
Yeah. So for us, I suppose one of the key issues for us after the lockdown, where we laid off 3,500 people, was to make sure that we looked after those people. And it's all very well looking after the people who are still with you in the business, but looking after the people that were laid off was a critical factor for us. And we're blessed in Dalata in that we have great technologies where we have instant communication with our people. So every member of staff has an app on their phone, and we can directly communicate with both audio, visual, memos. Everything is there for them, including their rosters. Everything is on their app. So we can communicate very well with them, and we use that to great advantage. We also have Dalata Online, which is our internal training portal. And the use of that has been fantastic during the period, where people, I suppose, are upping their skills across a wide range of sectors. And it was encouraging to see the numbers taking these programs during the lockdown. Now, as we started to return, we've taken back over 1,000 people across the two islands. But it'll be slow in terms of how the rest actually start to come back into the business. And I suppose what I need to do is continue to look after those people as best we can until we get greater visibility on what way the business might shape up. I think this year will be a challenge. And you will see other hotel companies and hotels introducing redundancy programs. There's already lots of rumours on the streets about that happening, and I think that will be a telling factor as we roll through the balance of this year and into next year. My objective is to try and keep people as employed as possible in innovative ways. So rather than bringing somebody back maybe on a 5-day week, bring them back on a 3-day, and then bring somebody else back in a 2-day, but get the numbers that I can back so that we're supporting as many people as possible and keeping the teams intact as possible, because we have invested heavily in our people. And don't forget that I have 11 hotels coming down the track, and I need to be building the teams for those, which I am. So all of those teams will come internally, and they're already being put in place. So I have opportunity coming for people if they can bear with me for that period of time.
So effectively getting through this difficult period might make the staffing of these 11 and more hotels marginally easier in the longer run as Dalata become a stronger player and a beacon of light to employees.
Absolutely, and like even last year in 2019, people talked a lot about people being unable to get people, and thankfully in Dalata we had very little issues around recruitment, and that's because we've done lots of innovative things. Like, to give you one example with our head chefs, that we promote them because they can cook, but then we give them a business to manage. and no skills. So with Tralee Institute of Technology, we developed our head chef program and our sous chef program. So all of them have to complete this program, and it teaches them how to manage their business, and how to do simple things like calculating GPs and doing simple things like that. And why we all take that for granted. This is new territory for a lot of people, and it's giving them confidence. And obviously then, because we have a central purchasing structure, Procure Wizard, they all had to be trained and developed on that. And some of them wouldn't have the confidence. But now, of course, because we've developed them, it has transformed that whole area. So recruitment and retention of chefs almost disappeared overnight as a problem. And we've done the same with our leisure club managers. So anybody who is managing a business for us internally are given the required skills. And that has had huge impact on retention, huge impact. And it also means that we have, dare I say it, a better caliber of person looking to join the company. So recruitment wasn't a problem for us, won't be a problem. And even as we get into 21 and 22, I don't see it as a problem, providing we continue to do the things that are really important to people. And it's about growing them as individuals. That's the key.
So a lot of people in the office environment have been working remotely, Zoom, team calls, etc. And it's, I will say, a lot of it is relatively new to me and probably to you. And it's been a means to an end. Do you see people working like that long term, and younger people doing that and embracing it and leaving the office behind?
I think, for a period of time, people will look at this as kind of a nice, idyllic type of situation where they can work from home, where they don't have to commute, where they don't have to do that. But what's going to happen is there's always unintended consequences for everything. And the unintended consequence of home working will be out of sight, out of mind. And if you're an ambitious young person and you assume that I can go off to the wilds of Mayo and work, suddenly you'll find yourself, that's where you'll be. And your opportunity to grow within an organisation will essentially disappear. And I think people will suddenly realise that. The other thing that we have to be very mindful of is that how do we bring the next generation on? How do we give them the required skills to do what they can pick up in an office environment on a daily basis? I think a lot of that kind of, I suppose, undercover kind of development of people. When that disappears, people will find that things don't work as well as they used to. Communication will be more challenging, even though we all have our Zooms or our Microsoft Teams or a plethora of other kind of media structures that has helped us in the short term. But do I see it as a long-term solution? I think what you'll find is that there'll be more flexibility. So people may come into the office for 3 days a week and maybe work from home for 2 or whatever. But people need to be very mindful that while it sounds idyllic, just be careful out there.
And is that any threat to the hotel industry, the city, the corporate hotel, the convention hotel?
Actually, ironically, it'll throw up opportunities. Because what will happen is, and we're already seeing it, where we are getting demand for space from people who have offices but may need to take over some of that space for distancing and doing all of that, and want meeting space because a lot of the meeting space will disappear in offices. And the other thing, of course, is that if somebody is working for 3 days from the office, they may require accommodation. So there's a lot of little angles that you can work on this. As I always say, out of every crisis, there's a positive if you're willing and you're structured to take advantage of it. So while we might lose on one side, we will gain on something else. That's the reality of it. And it'll change for us, but I still see the need to make sure that we have space to do things, and we may have to make our space more flexible. So there's lots of things like that that's going on in our heads.
Speaking of the lockdown, the phases in Ireland were very well laid out and were accelerated at one stage, and then phase 4 was delayed. The major impact on hotels, I think, is weddings, the restricted numbers. Obviously the pub trade has been hit hard by that. Any opinion on that or views of the future?
Yeah, I'll be perfectly honest with you. It didn't come as a surprise to me that they delayed it. I just felt that there were changes afoot. And to be fair, since the 29th of June, when they had the last phase open, things have held pretty well together. We've had some breaches. I do think that if I was a publican in the west of Ireland, I'd feel pretty hard done by, because like most of the issues are in urban areas, and therefore, you know, there's very little incident in kind of provincial Ireland, for want of a better word. The problem that you have is that it's like a pressure valve, and if you're a young person today and you know the outlet for a pint or two in the pub is gone, guess what? You're going to find another solution, and that's what's happening, unfortunately. So sometimes, again, the unintended consequences of keeping particularly rural pubs shut, it means that young people will have house parties and do things, and like when you're young, you feel that you'll survive anything, so it doesn't really matter, and you might get a bit of a flu or a virus or whatever, but look, I'll be grand in a few weeks and it'll be all done. So that's the kind of mindset that builds up. So I do think it's challenging. I do think it's desperately challenging for hotels, particularly hotels with large venues, that they're the same as a hotel with a small venue. I do think that there should be rules that govern extra space, because some hotels can do more than the current 50, and we could do more than the current 100, but would be restricted from doing so. To give you an example, we can take 1,200 people here in the ballroom, and FAI were going to have their AGM, and 160 people, which we weren't allowed to do anyway, wouldn't fit when you put in social distancing. And it's because, and it's all measured out, and you say to yourself, now that's quite a challenge, because what you have to do is, like 2 meters is, like has a huge bearing. Like if it's down to 1 meter, it means 4 times the people. So that's how it works. So if there's 1 meter distancing, we'd be able to take 4 times the 160.
That really shows the challenges of the industry, because I think a lot of our listeners will have been at functions here in the Clayton Burlington Hotel, yes, and there have been 1,200 people in the room.
Correct. And that is going to be quite a challenge as we move forward. Now, hopefully, the way and the news coming out around the vaccines is pretty positive at this stage. And what I like about it is that a lot of the medical companies developing these are working together. So there's a lot of cooperation going on worldwide. Like there's something like 10 major companies in moving from 3 to 5, stage 4 of testing, which is unheard of actually within the space of months. Like normally these things can take years, but they have moved at a pace, and when cooperation is there, so I've been very hopeful. I'm still sticking to the fact that we will more than likely have a vaccine in October, November time of this year. Now, whether it's available out there, but I think one will be ready for use, for want of a better word. And therefore, I think that will ease people's minds considerably for once that's in place. So I'd be because we simply, economically, we can't operate the way the restrictions are in place now.
So the announcement of a vaccine, Pat, that would be regarded as a cure, is there anything in your lifetime of work that would be news like that lifted the hotel industry previously? What were the other events that gave the industry a boost?
Well, to put it all this in context and where we are today in context, my first crisis was the oil crisis in the early 70s. And everybody thought the world was going to end, because there was cars stuck everywhere. Well, there wasn't that many cars anyway, but the few that were here...
There were queues at the fuel pumps.
Correct. Well, you couldn't even get to the fuel pumps in most cases, because you ran out long before you got there. And everybody thought the world, and of course, like offices and businesses were down to working 3 days a week because they had no energy and all of these things, so it was kind of madness. But then move into the early 80s, we had a kind of a huge recession. Like the 80s, like across Europe, was a sad place to be. Like there was nothing happening. It was really difficult going. And then you move into the 90s, you had the first Gulf War, which again shook kind of the world. It started kind of with the Libya bombings in 86, when all the Americans just decided it was unsafe to travel anywhere. That's kind of the thing that happened. Exactly. You had a lot of things that made people nervous about traveling. And then you got into the early 90s, and the Gulf War, really kind of the first Gulf War put the tin hat. When you got into the early 2000s, you had 9/11, you had the dot-com, you had SARS, you had all of those things kind of. And coming shortly after that, then you had things like the ash cloud coming up, and then you had the financial crisis, and all of those. Put all of those together in one pot, and they're only a fraction of what we've experienced today. All of those things together has far less effect than what we're going through today. This, like, going back to my 50-odd years, I had never closed a hotel until March of this year, and then I had to close 29 of them virtually overnight. So that'll give you
puts it in context, doesn't it?
Yeah. So we are in a very different place, and the other problem we have is that the outcome, and when we get out of this, is so uncertain as well. And like for us trying to do forecasts, which kind of is very critical for us when we look forward to the balance this year. In reality, in July, I would have fair level of certainty, know what my outcome would be for December of this year. I know what my end of year result would be within maybe a few €1,000, give or take. And I'd have a fair idea how I'm shaping up for 21. I can't even tell you how I'm going to be at the end of August, because we are so dependent, because essentially nearly every day you're starting from scratch and you're hoping to build. So it is such an unknown quantity for us, and you're trying to manage cost around that and all the challenges that go with that. So we are in such a different place. And what we need to do is get back to the patterns of business that we know and understand. And then that allows us to forecast in a much better way.
And the governments and central banks have provided, unheard of stimulus and supports, and that's been in Ireland as well. Now the UK have moved ahead and reduced VAT recently from 20% to 5%, and the Irish stimulus package is expected in the coming days.
Yes.
What are your top 3 requests for government support for the hotel industry?
So I suppose the first one would be obviously VAT. I think that's pretty critical that we get back. Now, there's this argument whether VAT should come down to 5% or whether it should be 9%. My own view is that if somebody said to me, the VAT will be at 9% for the next 4 years, or do what the UK have done, bring VAT down for 6 months, which is okay, but it's only okay. I'd much prefer to have this on a long-term basis, because that means we can plan better and it's much more beneficial to us. So the VAT is one thing. The employee subsidies is the other thing that is pretty critical and allows us to keep people in jobs that we mightn't necessarily do so otherwise. And then I think for the industry, I think they will need funding for liquidity. And you might say, well, look, if you're sitting there with your 200 million, you don't need it. And I don't, and I won't get it anyway. But I think for a lot of businesses, they will need funding, and it's not necessarily in the form of loans. I think it has to be in the form of grants, because essentially most of them can't afford it. Even if it's a zero loan, they can't afford it. If they have to pay it back, it's going to be trouble. So it'll be those kind of three things that would be to the forefront of my mind that you have in place.
And that last piece is pretty crucial. And from my reading, the German economy, the UK economy, even the US has dispersed more in kind of state aid, loans, grants to industry so far.
Yeah.
And that's the piece we need in Ireland.
We absolutely do. And we have a pretty high expectation that as we get into next week, that we get far greater clarity on how the overall business world will fare as a result of this, and of course how our people will fare as well. That's obviously the critical part too. So there's a lot of unknowns in this space, but we have an expectation that in the announcement when it comes should be very beneficial. And hopefully it's needed only for the short term, but we simply don't know at this point in time.
Pat, you've been very clear today. Thank you very much for your time, and the very best wishes to you and the wider Dalata team for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Enjoy the conversation.